Hello, marketers. This is the Funnel Lab. Welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. Funnel Lab Fridays is a weekly LinkedIn live session where we dive into use cases and challenges data savvy marketers face. I'm your guest host, Doug Bell. I run marketing here at CaliberMind and am a partner and CMO with Chief Outsiders. I'm stepping in for our regular host, Eric Westerkamp. Joining me today are Misha Salkinder and Zee Jeremic of Mass Engines. And today, Zee, Misha, and I are going to be talking about build versus buy, the delta, the difference between do-it-yourself and attribution platforms. Welcome, Zee and Misha. Misha, welcome back to the Funnel Lab. It's been a bit. Tell us about your role at CaliberMind.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show again. I spend a lot of time on the intersection of data and marketing analytics. I help support our customer-facing team, and kind of a day revolves between trying to answer some difficult analytics questions and spending a lot of time in code when questions get particularly hairy.
Awesome. Misha, welcome back. Zee, this is your first time on the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, Mass Engines.
Cool. Thanks, Doug. So my name is Zee Jeremic. I'm the founder and CEO of Mass Engines. We are a demand generation and marketing operations agency, working with companies to help them increase conversions through the funnel.
Well, and Zee, you and Misha are here with some real intent. It wasn't just a casual, hey, we're having a beer and you guys are going to join the show today. Zee, most of the market, as we know, tends to defer back to what you help companies do so well, which is build their own attribution solutions. And so today we want to sort of talk about why companies make those decisions, sort of what leads them to that. And then, we deal with it here at CaliberMind quite a bit. We replace those self-builds. So Misha's got a lot of insight as to sort of what that transition looks like. So let's have you start us out today, Zee. Why do companies build their own attribution solutions rather than buying? And sort of what are some of the factors at play when your clients decide to build?
I think the idea of being able to connect marketing investments with revenue outcomes, I think it's slowly gathering pace. And I usually look at it, it takes a phased approach, and usually the easiest and the easiest place to start is to build your own. And especially when you look at most companies at this point have, an enterprise level marketing automation platform. They have a sophisticated CRM system. Most companies use Salesforce, but there are others. And when you look at between these two systems, you can actually collect a wealth of data. And as long as you can connect that data, you can actually start on your journey to attribution by at least setting up that first level, which I would call direct attribution, which is basically being able to connect, let's say, a lead, or more importantly, an opportunity to, let's say, the source. What sourced a lead, that campaign or the channel, and or what converted that lead. And I feel like that's a kind of a good starting point for any company. And most of the time, you can get that with a little bit of a lift from the systems that you have already and kind of get your feet wet. And usually you start doing that, you start getting some insights, you start getting some conversations internally around the value of marketing. And then it usually looks to kind of grow from there. And then you kind of look to build capabilities. And sooner or later, I think you do end up looking at limitations, or expenses tend to grow astronomically as you start looking to answer the next level of questions. And I feel like that's usually a fantastic time to look at buying, because the work has already been done to get
so what I'm hearing from you, Zee, is that there's really, we're going to oversimplify the world for a moment here, then I want to go over to Misha. We're going to oversimplify the world here. One is, as you're saying, it's sort of easy to start with. And it feels like there's two paths. There's I'm not trying to build an attribution platform / solution. I need certain information or answers provision to leadership, or I need to understand it for myself. So I'm going to do enough to sort of get those answers. And over time, you sort of, at some point, you're like, gee, I think I just built my own model, right? And then you're talking about sort of this intentionality, and this is really where Mass Engines comes into play. It's like, no, we have made a conscious decision to build our own. We're going to get help from an organization like yours. And so, Misha, when you and I, Z, were chatting yesterday about today, we sort of talked about common ground, and you mentioned a centralized data structure. Common ground meaning, what are we both trying to organize towards ultimately here? Can you talk more about that and why that's meaningful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in order to do this journey well, the journey of getting more sophisticated answers, getting more precise answers, getting smarter about where and why we should spend some of the marketing investments, you want you can absolutely, I completely agree with these notions. There's a lot that can be achieved. I think we both agreed that there's probably a limitation for out of the box, let's say, attribution solution from a CRM alone, because there's simply a lot of events, a lot of activities that happen outside of it that are recorded that you might want to include. So in order to answer this question, you really want a robust environment of data sources in order to be able to answer more nuanced questions. Now, at the same time, the reason I think both build and a buy option is very important is that you want these to be specific to your business as well. Right. And so if you were to only look at something out of the box, you oftentimes cannot get answers that are specific to the way your data is structured. So I think that yeah, I really like the sentiment. I think a lot can be achieved by connecting, let's say, marketing automation platform with a Salesforce and getting some insights. But as soon as you want to ask the next level question, and oftentimes I've noticed that these questions go beyond attribution, right? So you might want to build a centralized data system to answer attribution, but then all of a sudden you might ask a more nuanced questions. Well, are there campaigns that work better in buyers at this stages? At which point you need an entire data model to be able to break out only these timestamps. And that's where kind of a more robust environment that would allow you to do that comes into play.
Okay, good. I like this, folks. And you two are being so diplomatic. I feel like I'm in a negotiation right now because we're really not trying to say one model is better than another. So Misha, good job. You really did a good job of sort of dancing around judgment there, and I appreciate it because obviously we're a platform vendor, right? We want everybody to buy, right? As do all the other platform vendors, and we sort of see the back end of what happens when people go through a self-build and they're trying to recover from it. And you really nailed it, Misha. There's this level of sort of growth in those models that reaches a level of complexity that's difficult even for the best models to handle. So that's sort of our experience along the way. But Z, I want to come back to you because really, this is not incidental. This is what you're dealing with. This is what Mass Engine is so good at. Somebody has made a conscious decision that they are missing information that is critical to their ability to be a great performance marketing organization. And that's really where Mass Engines comes in. But what I want to understand from you is sort of like we know what buying signals are. Z, when we get on a discovery call or we give a demo, we're like, yeah, this is a fit. When do you know, like, sort of what's the thought process for new customers for you where you go, you know what, yeah, they really could use a custom build from an organization like mine? What are some of those indicators that, hey, it's time to do your self build? In other words, why are people making these decisions and what are they looking for?
I mean, it almost always comes to a specific pressure or pain, right? So, I mean, if you look at what's happened over the last few years, it's the money's not free anymore, and there's a lot more pressure on budgets across the board. And specifically, I mean, marketing budget in any organization is the largest discretionary budget, and it's discretionary because most marketing organizations cannot quantify the value that's created in the organization by that marketing budget. So naturally, you start looking at your budget being pressured and cut, and you start being asking tough questions to justify specific expenses, right? Like, well, if you have your budget cut and all of a sudden you have to cut your, let's say, events budget by 20 or 30%, or your ad buying by 20 or 30%, what do you cut? And obviously, the obvious answer is, well, we want to cut the low performers, but that presumes that you understand what the low performers are. So it all builds. But ultimately, I think most of the time it starts from pressure, and that pressure tends to come generally from the outside. But sometimes it can be inside as well. Like you can have, and I think, Misha kind of like alluded to some of the questions as you kind of go down the road that you can be asking. But some of the early questions that can come from your own team are which which campaigns are most effective at sourcing leads rather than converting leads? Which campaigns accelerate the buying journey? And these are the types of questions that in most organizations cannot be answered with data. And it really comes down to a judgment call based on previous experience, which may or may not apply as considering how quickly, everything is changing. So I think that this is usually where you start looking. And I think in most organizations, it's not a question of do I build or buy? It really comes down to I have a need. And what's the fastest or easiest way for me to fulfill on this need? And I think usually that's where companies usually will even try, even most companies that we talk to have some basics in place. And what they're finding, it's just not enough. They're unable to answer the specific questions. And that's where, they'll start looking internally. They might start talking to us or other companies that can help them answer those questions. And then, as Misha said, once, you start reaching there's a point in which it becomes too expensive and takes too long to get the answers to those more complex, sophisticated questions. And even we've actually told that to a few companies that this question is that now the questions that you're starting to ask once you get those basics answered, you're starting to look at, months and, 5-6 figure expenses to be able to answer them. And that's usually where I think it does make sense to look at, is it time for us to buy?
Okay, I feel like we're in a red pill, blue pill moment, which is really the reasons for needing an attribution solution, like the push, if you will, is the same. It's the same. Like I'm not hearing any differences here at all. And really, I think the conversation I want to have with both you guys, because red pill, blue pill, red pill, I'm going to go with the platform, blue pill, I'm going to build my own, right? Like what I want to talk about then is, you sort of mentioned the externalities that are driving a lot of behavior in marketing, Z, and you nailed it. We have been in recession in tech and SaaS, AI chip stocks accepted. We have been in recession probably for the better part of 2 years now, as capital costs shot up, right? Money's not free anymore, as you said, Z. So like the flow isn't there. And the question I have back to both of you is, why hasn't this led to an explosion in companies showing up and going, I need to have this information, right? Or is that exploding in a different place that we're just not seeing? So, hey, CaliberMind's growing like crazy. Like I think we're seeing far more than maybe we deserve or compared to other SaaS organizations. So we're healthy, we're a growing business, but we're not exploding in the ways that others would have thought based on what you just talked about. See, so I'm really curious, is this money just simply, are people afraid to spend, or are they still sort of skeptical about the value of platforms or self-builds to deliver answers?
I mean, I'll share with you my opinion here because that's really I think what it comes down to. And I've asked myself the same question. I've had this conversation a number of times, and it's interesting. Where I've landed is that I think the answer to that is that marketing leadership that controls budgets has been used to dealing with that kind of the ups and downs, and has been used to defending their budget with a lack of data. And so I feel like there's a little bit of same old, same old. You're reproducing what you've grown up in or what you've been successful at doing. And investing money in attribution is still a new concept, I think, for most. And the idea that you can. Now, that's slowly changing, but it's a very, pace of change is very slow in general, even though externally, technology is changing extremely rapidly, but people change very slowly. And change is dangerous, change is, risky. And so most people tend to stick with what they know and stay away from things they don't know or things that are, could just end up being, we spent a lot of money and we didn't really get a lot of value. And that I feel like that's always the risk when it comes to new technology. And so it really just, or new ideas, new approaches. But the ones that are worthwhile tend to stick around and tend to grow. And I think what's interesting is that we're now about 10 years into attribution, and it's still a very novel concept to most folks and most organizations. And I think it'll take another 10 until it really starts blossoming and expanding. And oftentimes it's the people today that are kind of going to come into leadership over the next 10 years that are going to where these ideas are a little more accepted or understood. And then they're going to be in a position where they're actually going to look to bring this into their organizations. And I think this is why, even for us, what we're seeing is that there's a lot more interest in attribution in areas that are tech heavy and that are kind of more progressive in terms of thinking, right? So we're seeing a lot of it adopted in, kind of the California, Texas, like Massachusetts, New York, where companies are really kind of under a lot more competitive pressure, and a lot more looking at how do I differentiate, how do I defend my budget, how do I actually push the envelope, and they're more willing to take the risks that are going to get them ahead. And I think attribution is still considered kind of an unknown, a bit of a risky well. This idea that you can quantify marketing is, I think, at a gut level wrong. Feels wrong to most marketers. It's a creative endeavor. What are you talking about quantifying marketing? Anyways, Misha.
Yeah, and that's no, I completely agree. I think there has just been a momentum. It came from historically it's a creative, so there is a copywriting. What's the right copy, and then there's been a shift to, okay, well, how do we start even testing the copy? Well, let's try different variants, but we can't really test it. We don't really have the system. So intuition, right? So there's always been a lot of intuition, a lot of, then it moved to, well, how many leads did this create? Well, this webinar got 100 registrations and this one got 50. Well, this one's probably better. But wait, maybe these 50 are actually much stronger leads, right? So there's this evolution of getting better data-driven decisions. I think we're seeing a rise in analyst roles for marketing. And these roles are requiring a different skill set. I'm seeing more and more requirements around SQL, around data warehouses. And then I think some of the organizations where leadership has really, they get a leader that really wants to make data-driven decisions. They want to go into QBRs and be able to explain to the rest of the organization why some decisions are the way they are. And not from an intuition standpoint, but from what happened the last quarter. And we find that these organizations, they look for a centralized data warehouse and an organization to help them with making this be easier. And then they look at organizations like engines, or perhaps even, a very large internal team to answer some of the why and how questions around this data. So I think some of the more sophisticated ones are looking at I would say maybe perhaps for infrastructure like CaliberMind, but then also some consulting to come in and say, well, I'm going to have to hire a lot of very different roles in order to make this happen. And there are organizations that specialize in making this be easier.
Okay, so I've got a terrible analogy, but I'm going to use it because it's stuck in my head. But what I'm hearing from you guys, analogy coming soon, ready for the bad analogy. What I'm hearing from you guys is sort of this, there's this fear of change. And I think this represents really all big sort of sea changes when it comes to software, right? There's always this sort of period of hesitancy. Can this software do this for me? I get this piece. But the other thing what's being implied by both of you is like, they already have people they can turn to. Misha, you mentioned this in terms of the number of analysts being hired going up. It's like, well, just go ask the analysts because they've got Snowflake and some other BI stuff. Just go ask them. Like, give me a report that tells me this answer, right? So you've sort of got this existing motion. Let's go to the data people. Let's go to the analysts, right? Okay. And what we're saying is, here's the analogy. You guys ready for this? Don't throw things at me. But I have a 13-year-old. the thing went from being this little tiny creature to this giant person in, like, I swear to God, 60 days, and is eating us out of house and home. And my wife is like, we're going to buy a refrigerator for our garage so she can fit all the food, right? So there's this giant walking around my house, eating me out of house and home. And guess what? All the food he's looking for is always in that refrigerator. And you know what he's constantly doing? Going, where's the fill in the blank food? He cannot get through his head that there is another refrigerator where all his food is. And on some level, I feel like that's what we're doing. We're saying, yeah, hey, guess what? There's a better refrigerator with better treats out there. Go there. It's almost like we're asking to break something that, frankly, at the end of the day, the BI vendors have created for us, which is this challenge that BI can answer everything. So I'm going to put it back to you folks. Do we think we're just too reliant on BI? Because guess what, Z, I think you're really coming in quite often when the BI people, when the analysts, when that team is like, I don't know how to do this anymore.
Yeah, that's so what, honestly, like what we've seen time and time again is that trying to rely on your data analytics teams internally in larger corporations is kind of like relying on the IT team to solve your business problems. They're technology people. And the same thing with their data people. And yeah, they can structure your data, but they cannot answer the business questions that your marketing leadership is facing. And it ends up being a massive gap when the marketing team keeps waiting or relying, and then they hire their own analyst and then be like, go work with that team to try to answer these questions. And it's like, it's a massive gap because you actually need to formulate the questions, and sometimes you need to connect the data in a specific way that's going to help you answer some of these questions. And again, this is where even the build versus, we do that on our side, you guys do that, but relying on an internal data analytics team, oftentimes they don't, again, it's like they're like IT people. They don't really understand what business problems and so you can ask them a question and they're going to either not give you an answer or tell you, oh, we need more, more servers, more data to be able to answer that. And then it's like you're a year down the road.
Yeah,
and oftentimes I apologize. There's a volume problem as well. So we do this a lot, and so a lot just because of a volume. We send a lot of emails, so emails perform really well. We should send more emails, right? There is no, and as soon as you put things in terms of ratios, in terms of, well, what are the key events, you start identifying that there might be a cost to those emails, right? Reduce attention. There might be certain campaigns that are much more efficient, and you just don't run because last numbers quarter showed you sent 1 million emails, and yes, they were effective because everybody touched emails. So some of this is knowing which questions to ask, and I really liked these earlier comments that sometimes looking outside to figure out what are some best practices and trying to connect the dots between what are the data sources that we have to these best practices in terms of answering more nuanced directional questions.
I'm gonna put a final question out to both of you. I want quick answers simply because we're running out of time here. But I think we're on the edge. Here's my opinion. I think we're on the edge of attribution being a best practice recommendation, whether that comes from the analyst community or where. I think we're incredibly close to that. Z, Misha, thoughts? How close are we to that time when you can't be in a lead organization unless you have attribution? Are we?
I think you've heard my take on it. I mean, I feel it, it's coming, but it's a slow. I personally don't feel like we're on the edge of it. I think it's a slow roll. And I think it's going to be 5 or 10 years before it's a must have. And maybe
5 to 10 years.
In my view.
5 to 10 years. You're my least favorite person right now. Misha, give me better, happier news than that. What is your sense? Do you think it's also a longer journey than we're hoping for?
I don't know if my answer is necessarily happy news, but I think that those organizations that will get to attribution will realize that that's not enough. That there are other ways that the same underlying data needs to be sliced in order to get truly meaningful questions that can be tactical as well that can help you in your day-to-day. I think attribution is a really strong model, can become a really strong model, but it's not particularly helpful, I think, in early funnel signals, for example. So I think but if you build the right infrastructure for attribution, there are a lot of other uses for that same data. And I think that these organizations will see, well, how great that I invested in attribution, because the benefits are way beyond only understanding what are the dollars that you contribute to each campaign. Because once you have this data, you can answer much more nuanced questions, like mentioned earlier, around things like efficiency.
Yeah, I feel like, so look, I'm an optimist by nature. I'm going to answer my own question, but I think we're at this click versus call moment. And what I mean by that is right now, organizations have to make calls to get this information, this data. Obviously, it's probably Slack, right? But it's more polluted to say click versus call. And then the elite organizations, the organizations that have embraced platforms like Z's and like CaliberMinds, they're clicking, right? They're getting to these answers on their own. And think about just even that 24-hour to 48-hour gap that sometimes happens when you go to an analyst versus your ability to get that data. And I do see sort of the organizations that are going to thrive in this environment are those that can click versus those calls. It is always such a pleasure to have such experts like you, Misha, and you, Zee, on the Funnel Lab. I really appreciate you guys being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, hey, folks, that wraps up this episode of Funnel Lab Fridays. Next week, a regular host will be back from vacation. I think he's climbing a mountain, I believe. He's off on a well-deserved vacation. Next week, we're going to focus entirely on deploying the dream team, intent, and AI. We're going to spend a lot of time in CaliberMind. We're hoping to have lots of folks here understand why that combo is just so important. Have a great Friday, everybody.